All right. So again, welcome back everybody to General Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about how psychology applies to you, how it applies to your field. Maybe you are taking this because you're in a program that requires it, or you're taking it because this is the career that you're going into. In either case, we look at psychology in broad strokes and look at it in terms of how it applies to different fields, such as management, such as sales, perhaps. I think somebody here is travel and tourism. You know, I kind of need psychology for that. Real estate, really anything selling, anything that relates to people. I have a friend of mine that works at, or used to work for Walmart. He was hired as a psychologist at Walmart. And I say that, in an interesting way, because what he did, he didn't really analyze people or talk to people in the traditional psychologist fashion that we think of. Much differently, what he did is product placement. And you would have never thought that they have psychologists behind some of these things that you just see every day. But when you walk into McDonald's, or I'm sorry, McDonald's, into Walmart, the first thing you see is a display of something, and it really depends on the season. It might depend on what they're trying to push as far as deals that week. It could be one of those 5 gallon jars of cheese balls or something like that, or it could be summer gear or something like that. Whatever that is, each one of those items, each one of those racks has a special place and a special reason why it's there, and it's usually because that's what they deem that the customers are going to want to see. So that was his job, was to strategically place things throughout the store, to attract different types of customers through different seasons. So anyway, psychology just branches out into everything. Today, we're also going to talk about psychology as a science. And you're going to hear me refer to this several times throughout this course, that as psychology, we are a science, but we're not a hard science. Like, what do I mean by a hard science? Like, for example, physics, or chemistry, where we can always say that 1 + 1 = 2, right? It happens 100% of the time. That's what a hard science is. Psychology, not so much, because we are dealing with a lot of variation. We're doing, every person has an infinite number of experiences that they've gone throughout their life. So no two people are exactly the same. They may have similar dispositions. They may have similar ways of doing things. They may have grown up in a similar socioeconomic status, in a certain same development, but everybody is just a little bit different in a different way. So with that, it's hard to really predict 100% of the time how people do things. So in psychology, we operate really in the realm of norms and averages, and not necessarily facts and proofs. Okay. So just keep that in mind. And as we go through some of these concepts like personality or memory or learning or child development, all of these things, we have multiple theories that we operate from. So they're not exactly, again, they're not proof. It's not proof of anything. It's just our concept of how we look at them and how we operate, because a majority of people usually fall into that category. So just keep that in mind. Um, Another thing I like to start out from the beginning and write this down. See if there's a way that you can commit this to memory, because I would love to apply this and get your view. And if it doesn't seem right, challenge this. But I always encourage my students to look at the human condition as we are two things. We are lazy and we are proud. Okay. Now, I use the word lazy lovingly, in an endearing way, because not to say that we don't want to do hard work or anything. It's not really an attitude. What it is, it's a design for us. We like to have things in routine. We like to be able to generalize things in a way that it makes sense. And it's easy for us to put into a box somewhere and say, this is what we feel is going to happen most of the time. For example, if your UPS or not your UPS, your postal worker comes every day at 9 o'clock in the morning or something like that, comes up, knocks on your door or whatever, or puts mail in your mail slot. that's something you start to expect. At first, it seems really foreign, some stranger coming up to your door and putting mail into your mail slot. But after a while, you just kind of recognize that as something that just happens. That's not a threat. And we can pull back our mental resources and not really pay attention to that. That's kind of that's the laziness I'm talking about. That's just us being able to put something into a routine and call it for what it is, and just not have to pay any attention to that anymore. And that serves a vital function for us so that we can focus on other things. So pay attention to that theme as we go through the course. Also, we are proud. Now, what do I mean by we're proud? Our pride is our way of making sense of the world. We conceptualize the world in a certain way to where we need to be right. We have to be right, because if we aren't, the world gets to be very, very frightening. So again, it's kind of one of our self-defense mechanisms where we have to really say, we know what's going on here, and this makes sense to us. Even though it might be a different perception for somebody else, it makes sense to us. So keep in mind those two concepts as we go through this course. All right. So I'm going to share my screen with you, because I do have some slides. And how I generally do this with my classes is I'll share a slide with you, slide presentation, and sometimes I try and get us involved in some kind of activity throughout this course. Okay, so this is chapter 1, the science of psychology, and we're going to take a deeper look as to where psychology came from, a brief look of where psychology came from, and then a deeper look as to how we look at it as a science and as a profession. Okay, these are your learning objectives. I'm not going to go through each one of those. So the history of psychology. What I'd like each of you to do right now is take out a piece of paper, or maybe on your computer, or however you want to take notes, and write down one idea that comes to mind when you hear the word psychology. It could be a definition. It could be a profession. It could be characteristics of what a psychologist looks like or acts like. What are some of the ideas that you have with psychology? Anybody care to share?
Healing.
Healing. Okay. In what way? How would psychology be healing?
Working one-on-one with a psychologist, I would say.
Okay, in a therapeutic capacity.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that tends to be predominantly what we think of when we hear psychology. The classic, somebody laying on a couch with their hands folded, at the creepy little dude in the up above, or right by their head, writing down notes on their notebook. Right. That's kind of the traditional thing that we think of when we think of therapy and psychology. What are some other words that come to mind, ideas that come to mind when you're thinking psychology?
Like human
Analysis.
behavior,
Oh, okay, one more time.
human behaviors,
Human behaviors. In what way? What do we look at with human behaviors?
like their reactions to certain experiences.
Okay, okay. So reactions, as in, so for example, if somebody, I used to teach anger management. Okay. Um, Now, what I got, had a lot of people that came in and they reacted to different things differently. So, if, for example, if their coworker came up to them and confronted them on doing something incorrectly, that would anger them, and they sometimes would do something, act out in a way that would get them in trouble and land them in my class. And that happens, that really happens. Some people haven't really developed the skill sets that they need to deal with anger, but that's an example of where psychology can help somebody's behavior. Hannah, I see your hand is up. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I said analysis because even
Analysis?
like you said, everyone is different. Like with the anger management,
Mm-hmm.
like three people are yelled at for the same thing. One person's like, all right, what can I do better? The other
Mm-hmm.
person reacts in anger. The other person shuts down and gets sad.
Mm-hmm.
So what has happened to them in the past that has them react in this way? Like what positive or negative reinforcement makes them
Okay.
react like this?
Okay, and it's somebody that's skilled in psychotherapy, right? Or psychodynamic. therapy styles might be able to go back and trace those behaviors and those attitudes back to childhood, or maybe even adolescence, where something might have happened that they developed those behaviors or those attitudes. Absolutely. So an analyst would be crucial for that. Oh, I saw somebody else's hand. I think it was Joey. Is that correct?
Yeah, I said brain.
Brain, as in like the physical structure of the brain.
Well, like the human brain and how it works, sort of is what I said.
Okay, okay. So yeah, like neuropsychology or something like that, right? And when we get into this, I'll talk a little bit more about neuropsychology, but that's more about the physical side of the brain. When we look at neuropsychologists, they look at damaged areas, like if somebody endures a head trauma or something and loses part of their function, they would go to a neuropsychologist to or a neurologist to see exactly what happened and see if there's a way to regain those skills or repair those cells or something. So yeah, as you can see, I mean, we all have different ideas of what the word psychology is, but essentially in the book definition of it is the study of the mind. Okay, psychology is just the study of the mind. And we look at that in terms of behavior and mental processes. Okay. Now, speaking of mental processes, what do I mean by mental process? Mental process is something that occurs within, it's an intangible, it's an idea. We develop thoughts, and out of those thoughts, maybe we have some feelings that conjure up. And based on those mental processes, then we can kind of analyze, here we go, use the word analysis, analyze what an appropriate behavior would be. And that could be to physically move or do something, or to say something. But in any case, everything that we do requires some kind of mental process. And that was first discovered in Leipzig, Germany, back in 1879, where Wilhelm Wundt had the first psychology lab to study that reaction time, because he started observing people and understanding that while certain things may be automatic, there's some things going on in the background that we can't quite figure out. We can't really put a finger on it. We can't, it's not tangible. So he set up some experiments in there to analyze the concept of what one's mind looks like and what might they go through. For example, if I tell you not to think of the word yellow, okay, don't think of the word yellow. Get yellow out of your mind right now, okay? Now, somebody give me the name of a fruit. Quick.
Apple.
Apple. Okay. Anybody else?
Orange.
Orange. Okay. So many of
Banana.
you are, what's that?
I said banana.
Banana. Okay. You went with the banana. Okay.
Yeah.
But what I did right there is I primed your brain. I primed your mind to, I induced a mental process in there to tell you not to think of yellow. And some of you steered away from the obvious. If I said, think of yellow, now think of an apple, some of you, more of you probably would have said banana. But what I did is I injected a mental process in there for you to base your decision off of what you were going to say. And that's similar to what Wilhelm Wundt studied in his lab in Leipzig, Germany. Okay. But he looked at three components for mental representation and mental processes. And he coined the word objective introspection, which took into account three components: experience, that based on the experience, we develop an emotion, and based on that emotion, we have multiple thoughts that come out of that. And if you think about that, how true that is, if we feel a certain way, like say, for example, if we're very sad or we're very anxious about maybe a test the next day, we lie in bed and we think about that, right? Because we have an emotion about that. We have an anxiety about that. So that conjures up lots of thoughts that just keep going in a circular pattern in our brain, and it's sometimes very hard to relax and get out of. So that's what really the components that Wilhelm Wundt described behind objective introspection. Okay, Then we have Titchener and his structuralism, looking at structures of the brain. And he broke the experiences into emotions and sensations. All right. So similar to what I was talking about. Tell me about things that are blue, finding a purpose behind those thoughts and developing those thoughts, right? Or even further, developing those emotions. Why do we feel the way we do? And everybody could feel something different, right? So, and we can see that in eyewitness testimony, for example. We can have or we could have three people view one event, and all three of them can walk away with a different experience. And we'll talk about that. We're going to have an activity in that a little bit later in this class to see what some of those differences are. Okay. And then we have another big player in psychology was Margaret Washburn, who was a student of Titchener's. And she was the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology in 1894. She did a lot of great work and carried on Titchener's ideas about structuralism and functionalism, and then wrote The Animal Mind, looking at and it's not a book that I've read, but what it helps us understand is that we have basic functions such as, again, acting out in rage and anger and fear, happiness. These are things that we do automatically, and we do across the board, across cultures. Just about every human on the planet has certain characteristic traits, and we've evolved from those traits, right? Now we get a little bit more fine-tuned as we get a little bit older with our, we experience guilt, we experience morality. These are higher functions than what an animal can produce. But if you think about like how a dog operates, they kind of just eat, they go to the bathroom, they let you know what they want sometimes. And we sometimes mistake that as personalities. And to some degree, they do have personalities. We look at them as having personalities because they have certain characteristics that mimic similar to what humans present. But it doesn't happen, throughout. They have certain predispositions that guide their behavior. Some dogs might be more easily agitated, have that more animalistic brain, and don't rely on humans. Think of cats. Cats don't really rely on humans at all, except to pick up their litter, right? But we look at that as affection. That's something that people get cats for, is that they're fluffy and they cuddle up to you when they want something. So anyway, that was the idea behind The Animal Mind, is just kind of relating how humans have animalistic components to us, and not dissimilar to what animals have. Okay. What is functionalism? I'm not going to go too much in depth with each one of these, as it's pretty well described in your book, but William James understood the stream of thought versus the elements of the mind. He kind of broke off from structuralism to look at what is the function that serves. Why do we date? What is the purpose? Let me ask you, what is the purpose of dating? Why do people have the tendency to connect with another individual? What is the outcome, the long-term goal, do you think?
Life partner, I'd say.
Yeah, life partner, right? To engage in reproduction, right? Somebody that is into the dating scene, yeah, they may want to partner up with somebody, but in the end, we all have it within us. We have the gene within us to want to reproduce, and that's by design. We have to have that in order to reproduce. Otherwise, we don't pass that gene on to anybody else. So, and some people don't necessarily have that gene. We're seeing that more as an acceptance today. Somebody that may be asexual, right? They may not have that sexual drive. Chances are that they will not be passing on their genes because they don't have that inherent desire to reproduce in some cases. Focus on adaptation. And that's pretty much what functionalism is how our genes carried on. What is the function of our behaviors, right? You might see somebody that acts out in violence when they're confronted on something. What is the function of that? Okay, usually if you look behind that anger and that rage, it's usually rooted in a series of learned behaviors that have served them well over the years. But when they get to be adults, not so acceptable. So usually that behavior, the function of that behavior is to make things stop, to make people stop hurting them or stop causing them harm, mental harm or emotional harm. So anyway, that's pretty much what functionalism describes. Okay. Psychology's African roots. We have many of psychology's early pioneers were minorities. African Americans made a lot of important contributions to the field. And here's a list of several of them who carried on some of the work of many of these heavy hitters before, with like Freud, Sigmund Freud, and William Titchener. Unfortunately, just with the times, it was very difficult for them to really rise above and get published and gain notoriety in the way that they deserved, just because of suppression of African Americans at the time, right? And suppression of other minorities as well. So psychology was very much a Western society. It was brought up in Western society, and unfortunately took its roots in those pioneers of the time, right? But there were many pioneers that were minorities. Definitely worth noting. All right. Looking at different types of influential approaches, we're gonna look at Gestalt, we're gonna look at psychoanalysis, and we're gonna look at behaviorism. So those are the three. There are a couple other ones, but the three that we're going to focus on for this class are those three. And you're going to see them appear in different ways. Behaviorism we'll look at when we get into learning and developmental psychology. And when we get into personality types and emotions and motivation, we'll get into psychoanalysis as well as Gestalt. Okay. So with Gestalt, what that looks at is describing how we see the world. Okay. So many of you have kind of see that figure on the right there, which is, for all intents and purposes, a circle, right? But that circle is missing a link. Our mind has a tendency, going back to the laziness, right? We want to make sense of things. We want to connect the dots. We want things to make sense in our world around us. So our mind automatically connects those two, that missing segment there, to tell us that this is a circle with a piece missing out of it. Okay, so it's a way for us to organize our thoughts and to view the world and be able to troubleshoot and make informed decisions. And that's basically what Gestalt psychologists do. And when we get into cognition, we're going to talk a lot more about Gestalt and how we make patterns, how we see patterns in things that don't necessarily seem like they exist. Okay. And well, like I said, we'll get more into this. Okay, just examples of circles and things we see. Gotta love the graphics, right? Fun stuff. All right. So, what is psychoanalysis? Many of you have probably heard of a gentleman called Sigmund Freud. And who knows a little bit about Freud? Who was Freud? What was his contributions to psychology? What do we know about Freud at all? Anything?
I've heard of him, but I haven't no, I don't really know much about him.
Okay.
I think he was he was like called the father of psychology. Is that correct?
Kind of. I mean, he was definitely, excuse me, he was definitely a pioneer of psychoanalysis, which contributed a lot to our understanding of the unconscious mind. Now, he's come up with a lot of theories, and to be truthful, not a lot of them hold, pun intended here, not a lot of them hold a lot of water anymore. He was very big into motivations to boys marrying their mothers and girls marrying their fathers. And he put those in terms of sexuality in ways that they were attracted to things, to people that resembled their mothers, and that didn't quite jive. I mean, it was kind of a novel idea at the time, and he really did a lot of publishing with that concept. But several decades later, we determined that fundamentally it's just not true. But there are other forces at work that he did describe that we still use today, such as psychoanalysis. And the example you see here on the screen is an iceberg. And if we think of an iceberg, and this is kind of the model that he used to describe it, when we look at an iceberg, we think of just a little bit. Like if we're on a boat and we see a chunk of ice on the water, it tends to be somewhat small in size, right? I mean, comparatively to what's underneath the surface, right? And that's kind of the analogy that Freud used to describe a person's conscious and subconscious minds. Okay, so what we see on the surface isn't necessarily the entirety of that person, right? We kind of think of that as being true, right? How many of you go out to go out to your classes, go to family reunions, go to hang out with your friends, and you just give them everything? You tell them all your feelings, you tell them all of your desires, you tell them all of your fantasies. How many of you actually do that? Not
I
many.
don't.
Not many. I don't. I think I would probably lose friends really quickly if I did that. And many of us would. So what we see, we've learned to adapt to our environment in a way that we just show people sometimes what's socially acceptable, or just a little bit of what we want them to see. But it's usually to gain some kind of benefit to something deeper down inside of us. Maybe we have a desire to be accepted. Maybe we were rejected as a child or bullied as a child, and we struggled to try and get people to like us. That's what we're talking about with the unconscious. We may not be aware of where these behaviors came from or where these thoughts and emotions and attitudes came from, but they're there. And they show up on the surface in different behaviors and in different thoughts. So that's kind of what Sigmund Freud did, is he looked at psychoanalysis as a way to treat deep-rooted fear and anxiety. And his emphasis was on the unconscious and early childhood. He looked at trauma in childhood as being the root of how we behave today. And to some degree, he was right. Now, we learn to trust when we get into Erik Erikson's psychosocial development stages. We'll see that. We'll see at certain ages, we begin to have trust versus mistrust, or inferiority, develop inferiority over something, or autonomy, being autonomous and working independently. All those are stages that we accomplish. Does it have anything to do with sexuality? Probably not. And that was kind of one of the downfalls of Sigmund Freud's teachings, his concepts, his theories. Okay. Not going to have you open your book. So let's look at babies and rats. I think this is behavior. Okay. I might be missing a slide here. So when we look at behaviorism, we're looking at how we learn to react or think or or just put things together or problem solve. That comes as far as behavior goes, that comes from a learning process, and we're going to have a whole chapter dedicated to learning, and we're going to talk more about that. But essentially, what behaviorism, as coined by B.F. Skinner, proposed is that fear is learned, for example, and we can also guide behavior based on a series of rewards and punishments. And like I said, we'll discuss a lot more of that when we get into our chapter on learning. Okay. All right. So the field of psychology today, like we talked about, there are many different fields you can get into. We have different schools of thoughts when we look at psychologists, right? People that work with the mind, not necessarily getting into marketing or getting into management. They may use pick and choose from some of these perspectives, but for the most part, these pertain to the field of psychology and looking at helping humans in a therapeutic way, usually. So a couple of these, as you see here, and we'll go through them one by one just to give you an idea. But biopsychology, humanistic psychology, cognitive psychology, behavioral, evolutionary, psychodynamic, sociocultural. These are all perspectives that we're going to look at in this book. And just a point to note here is that no one perspective is really ever used alone. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, it used to be like if you had somebody that was Freudian, okay, maybe you've heard that term, but if they were Freudian, they really subscribed to what Freud's theories were, and they operated in that realm for the most part in what we know as psychodynamic. Okay, so that was several decades ago when people would either be behavioral or they be psychodynamic, and there were hot debates and arguments that really went in between them. So for example, behavioral would pick a fight with psychodynamic, not a literal fight, but they wouldn't subscribe to what they believed in, and they would say that psychodynamic is not a good way to approach therapy or treatment. The same way with evolutionary. So they were very separated many decades ago, but now we're kind of seeing this merging where we understand that a lot of people have different problems and not everybody is necessarily traumatized, which we'll talk about later, because psychodynamic is very, focused on trauma. And if somebody doesn't have trauma or they have a bad behavior that they learned that might be bad, they might get a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy as opposed to delving into why mommy didn't love you enough, which would be psychodynamic. Okay, so the psychodynamic perspective, as we talked about, focuses on the unconscious and early development. Nowadays, like I said, it was coined from Freud, and it looks at the ego and the superego and the id, which I don't think we're not gonna cover here today. But keep those in mind because they will resurface when we talk about the psychodynamic perspective. But today, the psychodynamic, anybody that practices in the realm of psychodynamic doesn't really put much emphasis on sex. Excuse me. Got a little dusty in here today. But they look at the more of an emphasis on the self and how we preserve ourselves and even develop self-defense mechanisms. Okay. Behavioral perspective, as we talked about, coined by B.F. Skinner, looking at operant conditioning as a term of reinforcing behavior or deterring behavior. And again, when we get into learning, we'll talk more about that. Classical conditioning, many of you have probably heard of Pavlov and his dog, his experiments with dogs. And there, when we get into fear responses, that's very applicable today. But we know that that's not the only way to look at how people form their behaviors. They can be rewarded or they can be punished in ways that is either going to promote that behavior from happening again, or it's going to deter that behavior from happening in the future. And again, when we get into learning, we'll have a lot of exercises on that. That's probably one of my favorite topics to teach. Humanistic perspective. When we get into motivation towards the latter part of this course, and we get into treatment modalities, we're going to talk a lot about the humanistic perspective. Carl Rogers was probably one of the bigger pioneers in this field, and he looks at it from a perspective that people have the freedom to choose their own destiny, and we generally just want to be happy. And he operated in that realm, and he taught that people tend to want to make themselves better. If they feel anxious about something, their behaviors are driven to reduce that anxiety so that they can move towards some kind of enlightenment on something. So it's probably one of my favorite ways, therapeutic models is a humanistic perspective and self-centered therapy models. So we'll talk more about that towards the end of the course when we get into some of those treatment modalities. Okay. Cognitive perspective, how we remember things, what are our capabilities? Because, and I'll tell you folks, working in the field, practicing in the field, there are some people that just can't get it. It's not a matter of not wanting to. But if I have somebody that is acting out and throwing temper tantrums and they're 25 years old, the first thing that I look for is their thought processes and their intelligence. So, for example, I mean, I've had that happen a lot. People that have been incarcerated or in trouble with the law or kicked out of group homes or whatever, because they are throwing temper tantrums and getting violent and acting out on that rage. Sometimes they don't have the capacity to learn as easily as other individuals. So we want to be aware of that. And cognitive perspective helps us uncover what is their current intelligence, right? Are they able to process in a way, it may take a little bit longer, but what do we have to do to help this person be successful and meet them on their level? And that usually comes through, like I said, that cognitive perspective. How learning occurs, how language occurs, right? We have, we looked at learning second languages takes its roots in cognition. Many of you have probably seen them using, has anybody ever used like Rosetta Stone or another form of language learning before? I see some
Yeah, I've
hands
used
up.
Duolingo.
What's that?
Duolingo.
Duolingo? Okay. So how do they teach that? How is that presented to you? Is it just repetition or how do they do that?
It is a lot of repetition and then like giving you like options and having to put things in order.
Okay. Okay. So chances are a cognitive psychologist was probably behind that, figuring out a way that people can learn this more efficiently, right? And we love efficiency. Remember, going back to that laziness. We want things to come as easy as possible so we can focus our energy on other things. So a cognitive psychologist is there, and the easier it is, the more marketable that product is, right? For example, Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone's a great example how how they've induced efficiency so that people can learn it a little quicker. That's a selling point. Problem solving. People in management want to know how to make their troops, make their employees a little bit more efficient in their problem solving. So, do they need to incentivize some program or give them raises or bonuses, or how can we help people problem solve and make our company better? That's a lot embedded in cognitive psychology. And somebody talked about earlier about neuroscience, neuropsychology, right? The physical working of the brain. We'll uncover several instances where people have a difficult time learning or remembering. Like if they have a difficult time remembering something, somebody might have short-term memory loss where they can't form any new memories. A cognitive psychologist would work with that person to see what their capabilities are. And then, of course, if they go to a neurologist, they would likely get a diagnosis of some kind of brain damage of some sort, if that's what needed to happen through brain imaging, which again, we'll talk about later. But the cognitive pieces to figure out what's functioning, what's not functioning would happen on the cognitive side. Okay. Sociocultural. This is probably one of the more recent advancements with the field of psychology and where it really came from. Like I said earlier, back in the 1800s, psychology really formed in Western cultures, European and American cultures. Outside of that, there wasn't really a whole lot published. Maybe they had some pioneers in the field in Eastern cultures, but it wasn't really, didn't really make its way into Western cultures in that market. So socioculture, probably right around the advent of the airplane and internet is where we started seeing people exchanging, coming back and forth between different countries and different parts of the world. People from India were living in America, and people in America were living in, well, probably not Russia, but living in different areas of the world, right? So we saw this expansion of people, and with that came everything we knew was based on Western culture, and it didn't apply to certain cultures. So the sociocultural perspective was kind of our answer to that. And it combined pretty much all the cultures of the world to make sense of why somebody from this tribe does something versus somebody from this tribe or culture, not tribe necessarily. But They might have different goals. They might have different laws or belief systems that guided those behaviors. Kind of thinking back to behaviorism. So socioculture was our answer for reaching across those cultural divides, and we're getting better with that. It's still not 100% perfect, but we certainly are understanding that different cultures, different folks have different strokes, I think is the term, right? And then we have biopsychological, which attributes human behavior and animal behavior in biological events. So why do we do things? Because we're motivated, right? Let me ask this. I like to kind of, and we'll talk more about this when we get into, I lost my thought for a second. When we get into motivation, why are some of you in college? Anybody want to give me a reason why they're in college? Why are you taking college courses?
I'm motivated to do better than my family, kind of. I'm
Okay.
actually like the only person in my family to be in college and take classes and actually get a higher level job, if you could say. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm glad you acknowledged the job. Why a job? Why is a job important? What does a job do?
Because I mean, right now I'm working at Wendy's, so like it's not very good, but it's a job that I can get money from. But I actually want to be in a job that I like to do and I'm happy with. I feel like this will help me get to that point.
Okay. And many of you probably have a very similar perspective as to why you go, or maybe you have different reasons why you're going to college. But most of us just want what out of college, long term?
Money.
Money, right? Why money? Why a piece of paper? Why do we want paper? Why is that important to us?
So that we can have a good life and provide for our families and not live in poverty.
Not live in poverty, right? That uncertainty, going back to that routine, that laziness, right? Laziness works for us in this case because we are working hard so we don't have to worry. Does that make sense? So we're looking at money as a way to provide food. So biopsychological kind of looks at that behavior. Now, dogs, for example, they may be able to do 1 or 2 levels. They may hear a bell ring, and that means that food is coming. And we can attribute, the sun coming up right before the bell rings. They can go a couple levels deep. But I mean, we are intricate. We've related. Our search for food has spanned out into where we live, the money that we make, the jobs that we have, the cars that we drive, going to college, getting good grades. We have multiple layers of motivations, but that comes from our biopsychological perspective and our animalistic instincts, right? And we as humans are very unique in that way, but we also share very similar behaviors to animals, which like I said, we'll uncover later. Evolutionary perspective, okay? Again, where did some of our traits come from, right? Why do we date? Looking back at the reason why we engage in courtship with other beings, with other people, is because we recognize that we are pack animals, right? We need to connect with people in order to get what we want. And we learn that from a very young age. We learn that from birth, actually, because how many of us were able to pop out of our mother's womb, sorry for the graphic, and hit the ground running and go out and get a job and get food and take care of ourselves, right? Nobody. We're not designed that way, right? It takes us years before we can really become somewhat independent, and even that's negligible. So, dissimilar to maybe deer or horses or elephants, where they come out and they're able to walk within minutes. Humans aren't designed that way. So we have a much slower approach, and we develop this necessity. We develop this dependence on other people to provide for us until we can provide for ourselves. And that carries on much into adulthood for most people. Some people love to live off the grid and, fly out to Alaska and live in the bush out there and not see another human soul for a year or two at a time. But for the most part, people do like to be part of society and be part of whatever changes that they need to make to be more civilized, right? But anyway, that's somewhat of what the evolutionary perspective looks at. It's just a biological basis for mental traits shared by all humans. So another example I like to use for that is if somebody came up behind you with a pair of cymbals and crashed them together and you weren't expecting that, how would you react? What are some reactions you would have?
Scared.
Right. Scared. Would many of you jump? Probably jump right out of your skin in some cases, right? It would
Depends on your upbringing. You may punch them back or something.
okay, yeah, absolutely. If that's your
That's what I was thinking.
yeah. Some people might get really mad about that and turn on that person and hit them or push them or something. But for the most part, our very first reaction is to jump. That would be described as an evolutionary perspective. Somebody that did not possess that fear response or that reflex. What do you think happens? I mean, if somebody isn't able to protect themselves when there's a potential danger around, what do you think is the potential outcome for that individual early in life?
They die.
Probably wouldn't survive very long, right? If they can't duck out of the way of something that is potentially hazardous to them, they don't possess that trait. If they don't have that trait, they don't have that reaction, they're not going to live very long. And an evolutionary psychologist would say that trait would not carry on to the next generation because they didn't get to the age of being able to procreate, to be able to pass on that gene. So that's what evolutionary perspective looks at, okay? Psychological professionals in the area of specialization, we talked about some of these. For the most part, we're going to be really spending a lot of time in the area of psychology and not necessarily psychiatry. What is a difference? Who can tell me the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Psychiatrist works a lot with medication and more biological stuff as opposed to psychologists.
Yeah, absolutely. So a psychiatrist, just for your notes here, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. So they go through medical school, they learn about anatomy, they learn about psychopharmacology, and then they have some specialized courses, about 1.5 to 2 years of specialized courses in the field of psychology, okay? Helping them understand about mental health disorders and psychological disorders. And mostly their goal is to figure out ways to not necessarily engage in talk therapy. Very few psychiatrists actually have engaged in talk therapy with their patients. But for the most part, a psychiatrist is there to dispense medication, psychotropic medications, to help people with certain psychological afflictions. Okay. Whereas a psychologist, their focus is strictly on the human mind and human condition and the scientific methods to improve the human condition. Some psychologists in some states are able to prescribe medication, but their focus is more on the therapeutic and research side of people as opposed to psychiatrists, which is there as a medical doctor. So those are really the big difference. Is psychiatrist able to prescribe medication, psychologist usually not. Now, most states don't allow psychologists to prescribe. Pennsylvania does not. I think New Mexico and Arizona might. I think New Mexico does. And I think Virginia for a while was entertaining the idea of allowing psychologists to prescribe medication. But for the most part, I'm aware I've had to take psychopharmacology courses. So I'm aware of what medications do what, and oftentimes I can make recommendations working along with the psychiatrist or psychiatric social worker to help get that person the need or get their needs met. Okay. And a psychiatric social worker is somebody oftentimes just works along with the psychiatrist to help them with medication. Another, and it's not on my list here, but another field that has been really coming up, and this really goes out to any of you that are in the nursing. I think we had a couple people in the nursing field here in this course. Psychiatric nurses, which operate, I mean, they're similar to nurses. You go through nursing school and you get your certifications, but there's another level of certification you get for psychiatric nursing, which allows nurses to oftentimes prescribe psychiatric or psychotropic medication. I work with quite a few of them. So as a psychologist, I might have a recommendation or a diagnosis to give to a psychiatric nurse, and then the psychiatric nurse, based on those recommendations, might do his or her own evaluation and then prescribe medication accordingly. Okay. All right, I'm not going to go through videos. I have these on here just to kind of give you an idea of what psychologists do. As you can see, a majority of people are self-employed. Okay. I'm sorry, not a majority of a lot of them. 35% of them are university and serving at a university capacity. The next biggest market for psychologists is self-employment. Usually they're the ones that are either consultants, you know, they go out and help people figure out their workplace, or maybe they're even working at a private practice or something like that. Private for-profit, you know, that very similar. They probably have a clinic or something that they're working at. That's their own. Private not-for-profit, and state and local government, federal government, and schools and other educational settings. One interesting thing about school psychologists is it's a very necessary field. And I've seen this interesting transition. I've got a couple friends that are in school psychology, and they're well employed. The problem is, you know, as you can imagine, with many cutbacks going on in the school, it tends to fluctuate. You know, when schools need to cut back their funding, usually, sometimes, you know, it's like art program, music programs often take the hit, and sometimes school psychologists do, but usually they can still work in like a contracting capacity with those schools. Just some areas that that people might work in. You know, clinical. You know, we talked about cognitive. About 13% are counseling. Now, when we talk about clinical, we're usually talking about inpatient, outpatient clinics. So, for example, if somebody has something that they can't deal with, they're having just a really tough time with stuff, and they may have entertained some ideas of harming themselves or harming other people. Usually the normal course of action is for them to get referred to a hospital, just to kind of get get some observations done, maybe check to see if they need medication, and monitor to see if those medications are effective or not. So usually that's the clinical practice that we're talking about that people tend to work in, is to help people in more acute situations. Counseling, 13% of counseling. The difference between clinical and counseling that I want to point out here is counseling can be anything. Counseling could be marriage, family, and marriage therapy, right? Which isn't really necessary. But if you want to keep the family together, or their kids involved, or if there's miscommunication, that's an option that people have, is getting in with a counselor that can assist them with improving that that medication. The other one I'd like to point out here is developmental. So a lot of times you'll see consultants or psychologists working with children that are having a difficult time adapting to school environments. Most commonly, we see people that are either on the spectrum, autism spectrum, or ADHD, or oppositional defiance disorder, or maybe even some kind of past trauma, having a hard time learning and adapting to an environment that they can learn. It's very important for children to stay in school and get education, so that way they have opportunities afforded to them when they get out of it. If they're having a hard time staying in school, we don't want to see them get put by the wayside. So developmental psychologists and a behaviorist usually come in to help out with things like that with children. Okay. And then of course you have experimental and other research areas. Not as big as you probably might think, but 8% is still pretty substantial. We even in clinical and counseling, we still do a lot of research and empirical work. Okay. All right. Let's see. Scientific approach. So how much time? What time do we have until? We have till 12:30, right? Okay. All right. So and this is going to be important for through this course. We have article reviews that we're going to be doing. Now, I don't assign the article reviews because I'm mean and I want you to read stuff that's way above your ability for reading. That's not why I do that. The reason why I do that is many of you are going to be going into fields where you're going to have to at least view this research. And if you're going into a master's program, you will absolutely be using some of the resources that I'm going to be teaching you through this course. So this is just an introductory to the scientific approach and how you view these papers, these journal articles are going to be very important as to how you develop those skills in reading through some of this stuff. So the scientific approach, was adapted back in the days of Socrates, where we wanted to understand the human mind and medical conditions from a scientific perspective. It'd be all too easy to see somebody and say, oh, I think that person has multiple personality disorder, right? Which is no longer the valid term for it. It's dissociative identity, but we hear multiple personality a lot. And that term has been antiquated for almost 2 decades now. But it's easy for us to as layperson to see somebody that's acting, maybe in split moods or something like that. They're happy one minute and they're sad the next. And we can say, oh, multiple personality disorder, right? That's not a very scientific approach because why? Because we didn't evaluate them. We didn't observe them. We're not using the right terminology, and we have to kind of see how other people in the past have displayed characteristics so that we can say that this is very similar to that condition. So it's not a scientific approach for us to do it that way. So in that, what we do, we walk through the scientific approach process where we ask a question. So for example, I'm going to kind of bring up a dark subject here, but it's one that's very near and dear to me because it's important that freshmen, for example, have a high depression and suicide rate within their first year of school, their first semester of school. So why is that, right? That's my question, is why do freshmen have a tendency for higher rates of depression? Okay, so I'm going to form a hypothesis. I'm going to say out of a 4-year college, freshmen tend to rate higher on the depression index compared to their other classmates, their other classmen, juniors, sophomore, and seniors. So that's my hypothesis. Now I have a statement that I can say, this is what I think, and this is what I'm going to test, which would be the third stage of the hypothesis, is I'm going to now design a research protocol, a way to measure my hypothesis. So maybe I'm going to recruit 800 students to do this. Okay, where am I going to get these students from? How am I going to reach them? Maybe I'm going to have flyers. Maybe I'll send out a mass email. Maybe I'll enlist the help of a couple classes or something. But anyway, I'm going to describe how I'm going to get this information, how I'm going to collect the data. Maybe I'm going to use a survey or a questionnaire, or maybe I'll have some other form that has been used in the past that shows efficacy in validity and determine whether somebody is clinically depressed or not. Okay, so now I have a way to test that. I'm going to gather the data from my population, and we'll talk more about that in later in this course. But I'm going to gather that data, and then I'm going to draw my conclusions. I'm going to analyze it, and I'm going to see if indeed it does show that freshmen do have higher rates of depression from their other classmen. And I'm going to go back to my hypothesis and say, is this what I found? If the answer is yes, I can say I supported my hypothesis. Or if the answer is no, then I rejected my hypothesis. Whether I accepted or rejected it doesn't matter. It's still, I went through the scientific process, and maybe my approach of collecting the data wasn't good enough. Okay. And that question still exists. I would just go back to stage one, try and narrow down my hypothesis, figure out a better way to test it, and then draw my conclusions. So that's kind of how the research, the scientific approach works. And then, of course, at the end, you would, stage 5 here, you would report your results. And usually you do that in some kind of writing. Okay. And again, I'll be showing that to you here in a little bit. All right. So some ways to collect data, going back to testing the hypothesis. Ways that we can collect data is either through naturalistic observation or, sorry, my bad. One of the ways is naturalistic observation, which involves watching animals or people in their natural environment. It's a great way to collect data with minimal interference. Now, why don't we want interference, do you think? What would be wrong with having some kind of interference in our observation?
So you can see what's naturally going on with the subjects or whatever you're watching.
Very good. Absolutely. Right. So if, for example, if we told people that we were watching them, that they might play a part for us. They may not act as natural as they want to be. So that's ideal if we're looking at behaviors that aren't in a clinical or a setting where that might be impacted. The advantage is it's realistic behavior. Disadvantage, there's no control. So, for example, we might have people behave differently during a sunny day versus a rainy day, right? We don't have any control over whether the sun shines or the rain falls. So there's that's really the disadvantage of that. The other type of observation we can do is a laboratory observation, which involves watching animals or people in a controlled environment. So we control the environment around them. We have control over the temperature. We have control over the light. We have control over many of the distractions. They can either have their cell phone or not have their cell phone. Interactions with other people, we can limit that. So the advantage is we have complete control. Disadvantage is oftentimes it's artificial behavior. They're acting a part. Okay. So ways to collect information would be case studies. That tends to be the most popular way to look at things, and that's a detailed investigation of one subject, or group of subjects. We get a real detail from point A to point B. We could study, like, for example, a child in a low socioeconomic status home, how their grades are through the course of their life up through college. Okay. If we track them from preschool all the way up to college, that would be a case study, right? Because we're looking at one person through the entire time. The advantage is you get a lot of detailed information about it, but it's very hard to get somebody to commit to that kind of case study, either the participant or even the researcher, right? Because we're talking about years and years of looking at somebody, which can be also expensive and time consuming, right? So that's a disadvantage. We also have surveys, which just basically asks a standardized set of questions for a group of people that represent whatever sample that we're looking at. So, for example, if I'm looking at the difference, the depression scale from 800 students from a 4-year university across freshmen, sophomore, junior, and seniors, those are going to be my population that I'm going to target. So those surveys would go out to each one of those 4 groups. Advantage is you can get a large amount of data from from a large number of people. But the disadvantage is that oftentimes this is, again, an uncontrolled environment. We don't know if a person is going to be responding truthfully or if they're going to be playing a part for us, right? So that's a difficulty with surveys. Throughout this course, you're going to hear correlation. Correlation is the strength of the relationship, or determining whether a relationship exists between 2 variables. Let me see if this describes variables first. Hold on, because I think it's important. sorry, I know I'm flipping through this. I want to make sure that I didn't miss talking about, yeah, okay, we'll get to that. All right, so with a variable, what a variable is it's a factor, okay? So for example, sun shining and ice cream sales, okay? Those could be two variables that I have identified. The correlation between them is what? It's the relationship. It's how one responds when the other one is present. Okay, so for example, we could say our hypothesis is ice cream sales in Harrisburg increase when the sun is shining, right? We have one variable, the sun, that we can measure. Is the sun present or not? Then variable number two we can measure is ice cream sales. You know, we can measure that because we can tell either how many ice cream cones were sold or the profits that were gained with the sale of ice cream. So those are two variables, okay? And we call that a correlation. Now, the strength of that correlation is going to be closer. If there is a relationship, it's going to be closer to either 1 or -1, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But the stronger that relationship, the more it's going to be towards either -1 or +1. If there's no relationship whatsoever, it's going to be dead center in the 0, okay? And I'll explain what those are in just a minute. Okay, as we can see. So for example, we can say the more education a person has, we can see an increase in education, we can see an increase in income. We can say the more a person smokes, the more health problems they're going to have, or the less healthier they are. Okay, so as one goes up, the other goes down. Now looking at positive correlation. This means when something goes up, the other one goes up, or when something goes down, the other goes down. It doesn't necessarily mean a good correlation or a bad correlation. It just means that as one moves in one direction, the other one moves in a similar direction. For example, they have on here education. The more degrees a person has, we can say the more money that they make. Okay, that's a positive correlation. And we can see that on a scatter plot here. Okay, so as you can see on the left axis here, the vertical axis, we have income. On the horizontal axis, we have education. As income goes up on the scatter plot, we can see a trend in education going up as well. Okay. Negative correlation is the exact opposite of that. So as one thing goes up, the other goes down. Smoking, the more a person smokes, the least healthy their heart is. Okay. So that we can describe that as there is a relationship, but it's a negative relationship. As one moves in one direction, the other one moves in an opposite direction. And that can be represented on a scatter plot very similar to that. As health as we see health goes down, we can also track the number of cigarettes that are consumed on that axis, on the horizontal axis. Okay. And here's more of a representation of what a perfect positive correlation would be on that first one. That would be a perfect +1. Okay. We in psychology rarely, I would say, in fact, I've never seen a positive correlation of 1.0 or -1.0. Okay. It doesn't happen because there's always outliers in everything that we do. And that's why I said we're not a hard science here. Okay. Conversely, in that middle diagram there, you see a negative correlation. Okay, that as X goes up, Y goes down. Okay, and then of course that the picture on the right shows no correlation whatsoever, just scattered everywhere. All right, so important. Understanding what independent and dependent variables. Write this down, folks, because people tend to have a very difficult time with understanding what a dependent and independent variables are. This is only when we're doing an experiment. So for example, when we're looking at correlation, all we're looking for is something existing. Is there a relationship between that? We're not exactly saying that one causes the other. We can't, okay? So for example, sun shining going up, we are tracking just through the summer months, the existence of sunshine and ice cream sales going up. What's the danger in assuming that when the sun is out, ice cream sales go up? Can we say that one causes the other, that the sun is causing sales to go up? I'm seeing some heads shake.
Possibly.
Possibly. Okay. Yeah. What's the danger in assuming that? There could be another variable. Okay. There could be something there. And I think I shared this with the class in the last class that we had, the last lecture that we had, that men who shave live longer, right? Sounds good. But does one necessarily lead to the other? Am I guaranteed, if I shave my face, am I guaranteed to live longer? Probably not, because I'm making a false assumption there. There are many other things that could be leading to that. So what we need to do in order to describe causation, you'll hear this, you've probably already heard this, is correlation does not equate to causation, which means just because there's an existence of a relationship doesn't mean that one is causing the other. There could be something, an explanation would be warm weather. If we did our research in only one part of the year where it's warmest, it could be not necessarily that the sun is shining, but what? That it's hot out and people want to get refreshed by having ice cream. So that would be an explanation for that. That would be a variable that we didn't really even see. So in order to test these variables, we have to set up what's called an experiment. And with an experiment, we're going to have those two variables that we're looking at. We're going to look at one causing the other, and we're going to adjust one to see if the other changes. Okay. So for example, type of dog and level of fear, right? So we're going to show a type of dog to a child and see what their level of fear is, right? Because our assumption, our hypothesis is, depending on the dog, the child might be more fearful, depending on the type of dog. So here in this one, we see a puppy dog. Our variable is either a puppy dog or a gnarly looking, mean looking, I guess that's a German Shepherd or something like, I don't know my dogs very well. So those are our two variables, or that's our variable, is the dog. And then the experiment, we're going to have two groups of people. We're going to have people that are exposed to the small dog. We're going to have people that are exposed to the large dog. And then we're going to have a control group of people that aren't exposed to any dog, or maybe exposed to something like a fluffy cat or a rabbit or something like that. And we're going to measure their level of fear. So our variable is type of dog and level of fear. Okay. So what can we control in that? Does it say? Sorry. What can we control in that experiment? What is it that we can control in that experiment?
The
Type
environment.
of dog.
Type of dog, right?
Mhm.
So we call that the part that we can control. We call that the independent. So write that down. Independent variable is one that the researcher or the experimenter controls. Okay, because we don't. It sounds opposite of what it actually is, but the independent is something that we present. The dependent depends on what the experimenter presents. So what is the dependent variable in this case? What changes based on what we present with the independent variable?
The level of fear.
The level of fear, we can't control that. That's what we want to see if it changes, but we want to use the dogs, the type of dog, to either increase or decrease that level of fear. We want to see if that level of fear follows suit with, depending on what type of dog is introduced as a stimulus. So the dependent variable depends on whatever it is that we're introducing, which is the independent variable. So that's very important. A lot of people get that mixed up, and you will see this again, trust me. Okay. Experimental hazards and controlling for effects. There are certain things that we have to be aware of. For example, if we tell people that we're measuring how well that they contribute as volunteers, what could we see? Are we going to see people acting as they wouldn't naturally act? Are we going to see an increase of people volunteering or donating? Probably, right? We're going to see them doing that because they're being watched. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we get into social psychology. So there are certain instances where we'll use a single blind technique to not inform the person of what exactly it is we're watching for. Okay, in some cases, we might worry about the whoever's administering or whoever's observing having some kind of bias in there. In that case, we don't inform the observer and we don't inform the participant, which is called a double blind, which describes the experimenter effect. The placebo effect. Many of you probably heard of this term before. The placebo effect is when we see a change that's not attributed to any particular reason whatsoever. So, or that has to do with like the medication that we're giving somebody, or the treatment, or the intervention that we use. Okay, one of popular examples that I think your book highlights is a group of people tend to show that their features of depression have subsided because they think that they're taking an antidepressant medication when indeed they're taking a sugar pill, which is where the word placebo came from. Placebo means sugar pill. So, and they found this in clinical trials when they were giving two groups of people a placebo, a sugar pill, and they were giving the other group an actual pill that helped with depression. And they were seeing an increase in mood or a decrease in features of depression in the group that wasn't getting any treatment whatsoever. They were getting a placebo. So the placebo effect just describes a psychological effect that happens, that people will alter their behaviors based on what they perceive as being a treatment. And that's pretty much what that is. All right. I'm going to ethics of research in psychology. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly here, but try and pay attention. So one of the reasons that we have the protections that we do today on research is because we don't want to cause harm for any individual that's involved in that. I mean, you probably have heard experiments in the past, either psychology or medical. You know, we're kind of going through that right now with the FDA fast tracking some of these vaccinations, right? The reasons why it takes so long for medications and vaccinations to go through these processes with the FDA is because they want to make sure that it's safe for the public. All right. And I think everybody here probably has a differing opinion on whether or not fast tracking COVID vaccinations is safe or not. But for the most part, you know, that was something they had to balance. They had to say, we have a need for it. We're going to assume a little bit of risk in fast tracking this. So, you know, is there probably some risk associated with it? Probably. But they've done their best. They've done their due diligence within the time frame that they've had to produce this stuff in a short amount of time. So they bypassed a lot of those levels they did to protect the rights of their participants. Not saying that they didn't do anything, but they probably didn't go through the 8-year process it usually takes to get some of these things approved. But when we're doing research in psychology, we absolutely want to make sure we're protecting the rights of the individual, because in psychology, our number one directive is to do no harm. Okay. We don't want to create harm for a person that didn't previously exist or would not have existed on their own. So that's the purpose of research, is to get as much information as possible with minimal or no risk to the individuals that are participating in that research. So we do that through a series of informing them. We let them know. Informed consent is our way of telling them, we will be researching you. There's no there's no risk for anything happening, or there's little risk for anything happening. However, if there is risk, please let us know and we can get you the proper treatment that you need. Okay. Some deception might be justified, right? We have to let the participants know that they are able to withdraw at any time. And of course, let them know that their protection from harm, and also that their data must remain confidential. Okay. So whatever information that we've collected from somebody, that could be damaging if that was released to the public, how a specific individual responded on a questionnaire, right? They might be things that you don't want your partner to find out, or you don't want your boss to find out, or coworkers or friends. There are just certain things that, we want to let them know that their information is protected. So that way they feel confident they can be as truthful and honest as possible. And then at the end, we would do a debriefing after we've met with the participants to correct any undesirable consequences, like maybe they got triggered or re-traumatized, or some had some kind of bad psychological reaction to that. That would be covered through their debriefing at the end. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop here for today. All right. Any questions, or does anybody have anything to add about the presentation? I know I kind of went through it breakneck speed. It's because I had one day to cover 2 days worth of information. Like I said, this 14-week, we kind of had to cram a lot in. I wanted to get as much information as possible to you for today. Okay, I apologize. I just saw the chat here. Can you go back for 1 second? Charlotte, did you get the information you needed?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. I apologize for that. All right, I'm going to stop recording here. Any questions for me? Any concerns?